pretty much showed, I think, that scientifically the theory of evolution doesn't make sense. It doesn't agree with what DNA will allow. In other words, the theory of evolution was that life started with a very small organism, and then it kept mutating and getting more complicated, and evolved into animals, and then apes, and then to people. And so that was the goo to you theory. And the DNA characteristics have been discovered recently. When Darwin presented the theory of evolution the first time, no one knew DNA even existed, and it's taken 150 years to really understand what it does. And today we know that evolution could not have happened unless God inspired it, because random processes couldn't have evolved complex organisms. So we're going to continue that progression now. We're going to look at archaeological evidence that the events in the Bible were real, that they did happen. So we're, as I mentioned earlier, the last 75 years, God has been very active in the world, revealing his existence. The evidence of the Big Bang Theory evolved in the 1950s. DNA and its characteristics were beginning to be understood in 1953. And then in 1940, before that, in 1948, the formation of the country of Israel opened up the country to archaeological exploration at a level that had never happened before. So if you look at fairly recent times, going back to 1950, the prevailing theory among professional archaeologists and intellectuals was that the events in the Bible concerning the Jews were really basically were not true. There was no evidence they ever happened. So there's no evidence of an Egyptian captivity of the Jews. The Exodus never happened. There was no Moses. The Israelites never migrated to the Promised Land. There were no battles. David and his kingdom were things that never existed. No Solomon. And you continue that, and of course it continues to the birth and resurrection of Jesus. So those they thought were myths. Now what happened in the early 1950s was like I said, the opportunity opened up to explore Israel and see what was really there archaeologically. At first there wasn't a lot of effort on it. There wasn't a lot of funding. So what happened is a lot of Christian churches around the world devoted funds to support expeditions to Israel to find things. And many of the significant discoveries were made by efforts funded by churches, primarily from America, but some from Europe, but like I said, mostly in America. I'm going to show you a video that is a presentation by one of the church-funded archaeological explorers. He was funded by turns out by a Church of Christ in the Dallas area, and he was actively involved in this field for over 30 years. Now the videotape I'm going to show you is from, I think parts of it are from about 2004, 2005, and there's a little bit that's a clip that's from 2007. Now the reason I've picked those rather than some newer ones is this is a gentleman that lived through the level of conflict that was between the universities and the archaeological experts and the Christian churches in terms of what was true and what was not. You're going to find in some of his comments can be a little bit abrasive, but he calls a spade, so you'll see what I mean in just a few minutes. And it's interesting that when he made part of this video, Israel was at war, and this week they're at war again. So I'm going to start this here. His name is Don Patton, and he was there, like I said, for a number of the key discoveries. He's going to go through a sequence of things that he was involved in. The rough sequence is he covers a little bit about the Exodus, about evidence of the Jews that indeed migrate from Egypt, and they were in the wilderness, and they did cross the Jordan River, and they made a camp, and they were at Jericho and all that. So we're going to, you'll see that progression. And then later, he gets to the major discoveries. So he's building up piece by piece of some of the major evidence. So I'm going to start it here.
We've got some exciting things to talk to you about this evening, to show you. The most frustrating part to me is we've only got 2 30-minute sessions. There is much more evidence, and I've been a little bit selfish. I'm featuring the things that I've been personally involved in, or at least many of them. There is much more evidence that's available, but we hope to give you an idea. But in order to appreciate the nature of and the significance of this kind of evidence, I want to begin by telling you a little bit about the controversy, the context of controversy in which this evidence is being presented and is being opposed today. Notice the statement by Dr. Herzog, who's professor of archaeology at Tel Aviv University. This is the largest university in Israel, and you would expect that professor of archaeology there would be one who is telling you about things that support the Bible, but that's not the case. As in our country, many of the universities which used to do that now are dominated by those who oppose the Bible. And so we have statements like this. He says, "This is what archaeologists have learned from their excavations in the land of Israel. The Israelites were never in Egypt, did not conquer the land in a military campaign, and did not pass it on to the 12 tribes of Israel." That's what we've learned from the study of archaeology. Now, why would a fellow who is professor of archaeology in Israel make a statement like that? We have to put this in a larger political context. And I think we can see that context if we compare it with a statement made by the late Yasser Arafat, who is former president of the Palestinian Authority. And I think you can appreciate why he would make a statement similar to this. He says, "The notion of a Jewish origin in Jerusalem is a religious myth used to justify occupation and colonialism." Well, he's fighting a political battle. He says there never was a temple in Jerusalem, and there's no archaeological evidence anywhere this is a myth. Many of the secular Jews don't really care that much about the religious battle, but they know there's a lot of mad Palestinians. There's a war going on, and they like to live in peace. They don't like their malls being blown up, and so you just don't say things that aggravate them. So it's not going to help those who are religiously inclined, but so what? Peace is more important. This is the context that we see this battle going on in the middle of. In spite of the effort to establish Palestinians' right to the land or the Jewish right to the land based on archaeology, we need to just back up and look at the evidence and see what the actual facts are. And that's, of course, going to be our approach. We want to see what the evidence is for the Bible, for the history of Israel, from the stones of Israel. And I want to begin with the altar of Joshua, and I believe that's exactly what it is, on Mount Ebal. In Deuteronomy 27, we find the instructions given: when you've crossed over the Jordan, you shall set up these stones about which I'm commanding you today on Mount Ebal, and you shall cover them with plaster. Build an altar to the Lord with an altar of stones on which you've not used an iron tool. And so it's a very specific type of altar. They wrote the law in the plaster. They were excellent stone cutters at this time, just phenomenal stone cutters, but no stones that were cut were to be used here. Verse 11 says, the same day Moses charged the people as follows: when you've crossed over, you'll stand on the Mount Gerizim for a blessing. Then verse 13 says you'll stand on Mount Ebal for the curse. This is a good teaching method. We're going to read you the law. Now then, here's half of the group on this mountain and half of the group on the other mountain, and you're going to recite what's going to happen if you keep this law, and then the others are going to recite what's going to happen if you don't keep this law. And here are the blessings, here are the cursings. They understood exactly what happened, and of course we see those things taking place as they obeyed or as they didn't obey. But this altar was the center of that event. This is up in Samaria, and here we can see Mount Ebal and nearby Mount Gerizim. Dr. Adam Zertal is chairman, or was chairman, of the Department of Archaeology at the University of Hoffa. He was an atheist. He was taught in his education that Joshua, Moses, David, Solomon were all fictitious creatures like Zeus, and you don't believe this foolishness. But he's an archaeologist, and he begins to look at what you can find from archaeology, and he took the area of Manasseh, and over a period of about 20 years was doing a survey, meter by meter, of that area to see what could be found. And he found an altar. Well, nobody was ready to admit this was an altar on Mount Gerizim. They looked on top, and it wasn't there. And so they assumed the altar that you read about in Deuteronomy wasn't there. Of course, the high places were reserved for the idols. You study the Old Testament. Literally, it says this altar was in the mountain. It's about 2/3 of the way up. And when he came across this doing his survey, he reported it in the journals. Could this be Joshua's altar? And there was just a guffaw, just ridicule. Lawrence Staggers, professor of archaeology of Israel at Harvard University, says if a sacrificial altar stood on Mount Ebal, its impact on our research is revolutionary. All of us have to go back to kindergarten. Because they're teaching that none of this happened. There's no Exodus, there's no Moses, and no Joshua. But here's the altar, just as it's described in Deuteronomy. Well, it's not really an altar. It's a farmhouse, or it's a watchtower. Okay, but it's not on top of the mountain, and it's short and squatty. Not a very good watchtower. Doesn't have any windows and any doors. Not make a very good farmhouse. What is it? Well, they began to look, and we'll let Adam Zertal, in his own words, tell you the implications of this.
If there was an altar on Mount Ebal, the most ancient and the first Jewish or Israelite altar here, the meaning is that all the story of Deuteronomy and parts of the story in Joshua are scientifically true.
This is, I think, absolutely so, and even the enemies understood it. and so they opposed it. Here we see the altar looking across to Mount Gerizim, where the blessings were read. And one of the things that struck me when I was there, how do you get a group over here and a group that far away and you hear each other? We sent Dr. Willie Dye across to the other side. He has, by the way, 6 earned doctorates, archaeology from Berkeley. He went across and we yelled as loud as we could yell, "Dr. Dye, can you hear us?" He said, "Yeah, I can hear you." The acoustics were just, well, you can't believe it till you're there, and it's just astounding. It was apparently just designed to accomplish exactly what was done. As he continued to excavate and look at this area, we find a large complex here where a large group of people were obviously camped. It's been restored to look like this, and obviously this short, squatty building with the ramp going up, no steps, is exactly what we see described in Deuteronomy. Probably looked like this with it's being covered by plaster. And we're reminded there in verse 25 of Exodus 20 that it was not to be made of cut stones. You'll not go up by steps. This is in contrast to all of the Canaanite altars that you might find in the area. But exactly what you find. Well, what do you find in the center? Well, they began to dig down into the center of the area, and they found it was full of ashes. Isn't that a surprise? Some of the vessels there had ashes in them, and they allowed these ashes to be examined at the Department of Zoology at the University of Haifa. They found 942 bones, indicating some 50 to 100 individuals. And what kind of animals were these? If this was a Canaanite altar, they'd be sacrificing eagles and snakes and various animals. But not so with the Israelites. What they found were sheep and goats and cattle, all kosher animals, if you please. And of the ones that they could determine the sex and the age, all of them were 1-year-old males. Wow, this is not a Canaanite altar. It's not a farmhouse. It's not a watchtower. Pottery was also found, and both culturally and with thermoluminescent dating, which is most appropriate for pottery. It was dated to the time of the Exodus, approximately the 13th century. In addition, he found Egyptian scarabs that came from Egypt. This is used often to date Egyptian artifacts. This is from Ramses II, which is probably the one who was reigning at the time of the Exodus, though it's not precise. But generally the time of the Exodus. All of this fits and makes a picture that's just very impressive. It was an honor to be a part of the excavation there. But let's notice the statement by Adam Zertal, who was convinced as a result of this and other evidence that he uncovered that the Old Testament was God's Word. And not only that, that the Messiah that the Old Testament predicted was the Christ. And he is a believer in Christ and has established a church up there in Samaria, independent of any denominational organization. They're teaching what appears to be New Testament Christianity to me, baptism for remission of sins, and about a group of 40 up there in the middle of Palestinian territory. He published this material over a series of years, a number of articles as each was discovered, and then made this comment: what has happened regarding the new accumulation of facts I have cited? Almost nothing. Since the appearance of the detailed report and the many articles I have published on the excavation, silence has descended on the scholarly world. They have nothing to say. Well, I do. I think Professor Staggart needs to go back to kindergarten. That's what he said, and I agree with him. We find that Adam has continued to work and decided that he would look in the area that the Bible indicated would be Gilgal. This is where they first camped when they came across the Jordan. no one had really investigated here because most of the archaeologists had no confidence that this was a true story anyway, and they hadn't looked. And so he went to look. In Joshua chapter 4, the people came up from the Jordan on the 10th of the first month, camped at Gilgal on the eastern edge of Jericho. Well, that's pretty specific. Now, here's where it is. Those 12 stones which had taken from the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. Well, he found the spot and found more than he anticipated finding. Just was amazed. Here is the diagram that he has from his research. It's in the shape of a shoe. Now, at the heel, you find a configuration that fits precisely the dimensions of the tabernacle, which is what they set up here when they came across. Out on the toe, you find a circular area there that we'll look at again in a moment. But what is this about? And as he thought about it, he reflected back on Deuteronomy chapter 11, where Moses told them, every place on which the sole of your foot treads shall be yours. Your border will be from the wilderness to Lebanon, from the river to the Euphrates as far as the western sea. And then Joshua said in chapter 1, every place on which the sole of your foot treads, I have given it to you, just as I've spoken to Moses. The people got there and they set up this area to make the claim, this is ours. And they set up this double pathway of stones, the pathway in between the two rows of stones, in the shape of a foot. And evidently they marched around, perhaps with the Ark of the Covenant, saying, basically, this is ours. And that heel portion that you can see again is exactly the dimensions of the tabernacle. And that circular area down near the toe has just been, that hasn't been published yet. You won't be able to read this possibly until next year. But in the middle of that circular altar appearing is 12 standing stones. I think that's awesome. I know where those stones came from, I believe. But here is a picture of that double pathway that surrounds and defines this foot, where they were making, I believe, the claim, this country is ours. As you look at this off in the distance, you see Jericho. It's on the eastern edge, just exactly where the Bible indicated it should be. As we go to Jericho, of course, a very famous area and where a great deal of archaeological work has been done, we recall Joshua chapter 6, verse 3, you'll march around the city, all the men of war. You'll do so for 6 days. The priests carry the ram's horns, they blow the ram's horns, the trumpets, the walls fall down on the 7th day, so that the people will go up straight ahead. Pretty amazing story. Not exactly a reasonable sounding battle plan, just march them to death, go around and around, and it falls down. Well, this is not a normal plan. This is a supernatural plan. And a lot of archaeologists have been here. The original archaeologist, Garstang, did work in the early 1900s, was confident this was Joshua's Jericho, but then that was refuted, we're told. There is a cable car that allows you to go up over the tell, which you see here in the circle. This is the mound where the ancient city is found, and quite a bit of excavation can be seen from the air. Not too many people riding the cable car nowadays. This is the Hamas headquarters. They haven't quite got the knack of promoting tourism there, shooting everybody. But after Garstang had done his work, Kathleen Kenyon took over. She's one of the ones who we're told has modernized archaeology in Israel. And she says the city belonged to a much earlier time and could not be biblical Jericho based on the absence of the imported Cypriot ware pottery. This is special pottery from Cyprus. That should be there if this is Joshua's time. And there's some fairly reasonable conclusions regarding that. She dug and she didn't find it. And so she concluded it couldn't be Joshua's Jericho. She did acknowledge that things were burnt and the walls had fallen. The lack of pottery proved that it could not be Joshua's Jericho. And then she died, fortunately. We'll have more to say about her later. Bryant Wood began to work there in the late 90s and after the turn of the century, and found exactly what she said would indicate that it was Joshua's Jericho, but she says it wasn't there. He found that it was. This is expensive pottery. She was digging in the poor part of the city. He said you ought to look in the prosperous part, and he found lots of it. And we, by the way, do have an excellent example of that Cypriot pottery back in the museum, the artifact room, that you can examine. But not only did he find the pottery that she said would indicate Joshua's Jericho, he found a continuous series of Egyptian scarabs with dated inscriptions. I mean, how do you nail it down any better? An unbroken series extended from the 18th century BC, way before the Exodus, up to the time of the conquest where it stops. An unbroken series right up to the time of the conquest, and it's over. There's no way to establish it any better than that. He found a number of things, some of which Kenyon had found, the remains of a fortified tower, storage containers that had indicated were full of grain at the time that it was burned. Normally, you wouldn't find that with a conquered city because grain is a commodity much like our money today. And so the people that conquer it take the grain. But they didn't here. Well, we know they were commanded not to take things from Jericho. And furthermore, in Joshua chapter 3, we're told that when they came across the Jordan, this was at the time of the harvest. And so the storage containers would be full, and they would leave them full, and then the burned city is piled on top of it. Again, confirming what we found. He found the retrievement wall at the base of the tell that had reinforced it. He found the fallen brick outside that retrievement wall that formed basically a ramp going up toward the city. Here are some of those fallen brick where we were just a few months ago. This is the diagram that Bryant Wood made showing the fallen brick making virtually a ramp going up the retaining wall toward the tell, and this is the way they conquered the city. One of the most amazing things that he found, just made chills go up and down my spine as I looked at it. There was one portion of the wall that was still remaining. The whole wall didn't fall. There was one. Remember, there was a promise that was made to one whose house was on the wall that it would be preserved. And we look at that one portion that is left, and we see the house. I think I know who lived there. Joshua chapter 2, she let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was on the city wall, so that she was living on the wall. And she was promised that her house would be preserved. The only portion that's left. Well, I find that thrilling. We move from there to consider the story of the prophet Balaam. This has been one of the favorite objects of ridicule of the atheist. After all, he's got a talking donkey. Who in the world can believe that? And of course, that story is preserved for us in Numbers. He was working with the Moabites, the Ammonites, the enemies of the children of Israel, as at the time of the Exodus they were marching toward the promised land and were mowing down the people one after another, and we see what they did to this group and to that group, and the Moabites were afraid they would be conquered, and so they hired him a prophet to curse the children of Israel, Balaam. At Tel Der Allah, and the tell is a term for the mounds on which the cities were built. Usually they had been destroyed several times, and the mound was the accumulation of the destruction. They built the next city on top of it, and we find that all over Israel and in the area. But here is the Tel Der Allah. This is on the other side of the Jordan, as the Jabbok River meets the Jordan. And that was excavated just a few years ago. And in this Tel, they found what was actually an administration building for the Amorites. This is not the Israelites. This is the enemies of the Israelites. And it was covered with plaster. that had fallen off. But on that plaster, they had written various stories. And down at the base of the wall, you see the broken plaster that they then could put together, written on with black and red ink. And so, like a jigsaw puzzle, they put this back together to see what the Amorites had to say. And there were a number of administrative details that they had, but as they put that together, they found, of all things, the story of Balaam the prophet. Again, not written by the Israelites, but by the enemies. And here is one line which says, warnings given by Balaam, the son of Behor, a seer of the gods. Now this is from the 8th century BC. A story of Balaam the prophet by the enemies of God. Numbers 22 says, so he sent messengers to Balaam, the son of Behor, at Prethor, which is near the river. They saw what Israel had done to the Amorites. And here's what the Amorites had to say about it. And of course we continue reading the latter part of the verse. Behold, the people came out of Egypt. This relates directly to the Exodus, which the archaeologists deny today. And of course relates to what we read in verse 28, the Lord opened the mouth of the donkey. A crazy story? Well, we have archaeological confirmation of that story and of that prophet from the enemies of the children of Israel. I think that's awesome. This material is now on display in Amman, Jordan, and you can go there and look at it in the museum. Shiloh is the way it's referred to by most of the Israelis. Joshua chapter 18 verse 1 says, the whole congregation of the sons of Israel assembled themselves at Shiloh and set up the tent of the meeting there. This was the first permanent place for the Ark of the Covenant during the period of the Judges, and it stayed there for several hundred years. As you read further, you see pretty specific instructions about where this was, and so you can get obviously very close. And we found a church in the area that was built about 400 years after the time of Christ, the Byzantine period, to commemorate Shiloh, the place where they had parked the tabernacle, if you please. And the floor, a beautiful mosaic floor, happened to match the dimensions of the tabernacle, and so it was thought that this was the spot that had been chosen 400 years after Christ, long after, of course, the actual event, that was on the spot where the tabernacle was. Well, that's not really the case. Just recently, with further excavation on the tell, the northern part of that tell, they found that this was just to, yes, commemorate the spot, but not built on the spot. This is the gate that they found, and that opens the way to the path that leads up to the plateau where the tabernacle actually was. And it's so well confirmed that even the Department of Antiquities there in Israel has put up the plaque saying this, in all probability, is where the tabernacle stood. Up on that plateau that's been newly excavated, we have this stone wall, which was the base. Now you can't really get the dimensions in this picture. We'll get more in just a moment. But the thing that really nailed this down was they found 4th century BC inscriptions. This is 800 years earlier than this Byzantine church, that clearly identified this as Shiloh. Now, it didn't really say welcome to Shiloh, but it was pretty close. 400 years before the time of Christ. And as we look at the outline here in stone, we see where the tent poles were, the holes in regular intervals that go right on around and were to support the tent, the tabernacle. Looking at this picture, you really need to be 50 feet in the air, which was kind of hard for me to do. But with the line here, you can see the dimensions of the tabernacle, which fit beautifully. This is where the tabernacle was for well over 300 years, and where they worshiped during the period of the Judges. This was the capital of Israel during that period, if you please. This is where the sacrifices and the annual feast took place, where the land was allotted to the tribes, where Eli judged and Hannah prayed and Samuel served and where Eli fell and died. Actually, it wasn't here at this spot. The text says that when he heard the story of the capture of the ark and of the loss of the battle and the death of his sons, he was at the gate. Well, we found the gate, you recall, that leads to this place. This is where he would have been sitting and where he fell and died.